The year was 1305, and the streets of London rang with the calls of merchants and the steady rhythm of horse hooves striking cobblestone. But on this August morning, a different sound would soon take over, the roar of a restless crowd, gathering to witness one of the most infamous executions in medieval history. The man at the center of their bloodthirsty anticipation was William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had dared to challenge English rule and rally his countrymen in the fight for freedom. What unfolded that day was more than an execution. It was a calculated display of cruelty, carefully staged to destroy not only a man, but the very idea he embodied. Popular culture, shaped by films and romanticized stories, has reduced Wallace's end into something almost noble, a quick, heroic death for a defiant warrior. The truth, however, was far darker, far more deliberate, and unimaginably brutal. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, designed Wallace's punishment not simply as vengeance, but as a warning that would echo across generations. His death would be engineered to be so horrific, so public, and so widely remembered that it would forever deter rebellion against English authority. The chosen method was the infamous ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment reserved only for those branded as traitors, considered the ultimate expression of judicial cruelty in medieval England. This was not about the mere ending of a life. It was about dismantling dignity piece by piece, crushing hope, and creating a spectacle so terrifying it would scar the memory of Scotland for centuries. Today, we peel away the myths and confront the grim reality of William Wallace's final hours. To understand the horror of Wallace's execution, we must first look at the world that created it. Medieval Scotland, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, was a land suspended between independence and submission, where nationhood was still fragile and loyalty was often dictated by survival rather than pride. The Scottish Wars of Independence ignited after a bitter succession crisis, and Edward I seized the opportunity to tighten England's grip, seeing Scotland not as a sovereign realm, but as a rebellious province to be subdued. Wallace rose from this chaos not as a nobleman hungry for power, but as a lesser landowner, consumed by loss and outrage. His family had suffered under English occupation, and when he raised his sword at Stirling Bridge in 1297, it was with both the fury of personal grief and the vision of a man who believed in a free Scotland. His victory at Stirling was not just a battlefield triumph. It was symbolic, shattering the myth of English invincibility and proving that Scottish resistance was more than just a dream. But Edward I was no king to tolerate defiance. Famous for his merciless crushing of Welsh uprisings and his expulsion of Jews from England, Longshanks understood rebellion like a spark. It spread, if not extinguished, with absolute force. Wallace's success could not simply be undone, it had to be transformed into a dire warning. By 1305, the political landscape sealed Wallace's fate. Most Scottish nobles had already bent the knee to Edward, preferring compromise over destruction. Wallace's unyielding defiance not only made him England's enemy, it embarrassed the Scottish aristocracy who had chosen submission. His very survival was a living insult to their surrender, and thus his capture became not only a military objective, but a political necessity. The hunt for Wallace stretched over years, involving an extensive web of spies, informants, and opportunists. Edward placed a heavy bounty on his head, and the English administration in Scotland worked relentlessly to cut him off from allies. As fear spread, even his former supporters abandoned him, motivated by greed, coercion, or the simple will to survive. Association with Wallace had become a death sentence in itself, and so, inevitably, the betrayal came. In August 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, likely betrayed by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English rule. Though historians still debate the details, the outcome was certain. Scotland's symbol of defiance now lay in English hands. His capture was paraded in London as a triumph, but for Edward, it was only the beginning of the humiliation he had carefully devised. The journey from Scotland to London was itself designed as torture. Shackled and guarded, Wallace was dragged through English towns where eager crowds gathered to see the notorious rebel. This was psychological warfare, turning a leader into a spectacle, a hero into a caged animal. By the time he reached the capital, Wallace had endured weeks of degradation, yet his true ordeal still awaited him. The trial of William Wallace was a grim parody of justice. Held at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, the proceedings were carried out in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not understand. The charges were sweeping: treason, murder, arson, sacrilege, and countless crimes against the crown. Yet the irony was striking. Wallace was accused of treason against a king he had never acknowledged as sovereign. When allowed to speak, Wallace declared defiantly that he could not be guilty of treason against Edward I, for he had never sworn loyalty to him. His statement was bold, but the verdict was never in question. The trial had been theatre from the start, a legal facade for what was already predetermined. The judges, hand-picked by Edward, had no intention of mercy. Their role was to justify a punishment already chosen. Every charge leveled against Wallace was crafted to legitimize the brutality that awaited him. His end was to be not only a death, but an enduring message etched into history. Treason was the most serious offense imaginable in medieval England, punishable by the full brutality of hanging, drawing, and quartering. The additional charges of murder and sacrilege, references to Wallace's attacks on English troops and members of the clergy, were carefully framed to paint him as a mere criminal rather than a patriotic warrior. The English legal system had been weaponized into an instrument of terror, and Wallace was chosen to be its most infamous victim. The sentence was pronounced with great ceremony. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged by the neck, but not until dead, disemboweled while still conscious, beheaded, and finally cut into 4 parts. Each element carried symbolic weight. The drawing represented degradation, the hanging his rejection by heaven, the disembowelment his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his total erasure. This was not just execution, it was meant to be complete annihilation. On the morning of August 23, 1305, London awoke to a clear and warm day. The city had prepared for this spectacle in advance, scaffolds erected and crowds summoned from across the realm to see the death of Scotland's most defiant rebel. Authorities had turned Wallace's execution into a grotesque festival, with vendors selling food and drink. For many, this was not about justice, it was entertainment. A reminder of the overwhelming power of the English crown and the merciless fate awaiting all who defied it. Wallace was stripped and bound to a hurdle, a rough wooden frame to which his body was tied before being dragged through the streets. The route was deliberately chosen to pass through London's busiest districts, ensuring maximum humiliation and exposure. From the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned, the procession wound its way through crowded thoroughfares. The cobblestones cut and tore at his body as he was pulled behind horses, leaving a trail of blood marking his final journey. The people who gathered to watch were varied, some curious, some loyal to the crown, others simply eager for the gruesome entertainment. Medieval executions were public theatre, both a diversion and a sharp reminder of royal authority. As Wallace was dragged through the city, the crowds jeered, mocked, and hurled refuse at him. Their cruelty was encouraged by officials who wanted his suffering to be amplified and his humiliation absolute. The procession was drawn out deliberately, moving slowly to give more people time to join the spectacle and to prolong Wallace's torment. Eyewitness accounts describe him as conscious throughout, his eyes staring ahead at some unseen point, as if looking beyond the horror around him. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or simply shock can never be known. But what was remembered was striking. Wallace never begged, never cried out for mercy. That silent endurance would later become part of his legend. At Smithfield, the city's notorious execution ground, a great scaffold had been built specifically for the event. Here, the largest crowds gathered, men, women, and even children who had staked out vantage points early in the day. The atmosphere was disturbingly festive, a carnival of cruelty. Vendors sold pies, ale, and trinkets while the crowd buzzed with anticipation. The authorities wanted this death not to be mourned as martyrdom, but celebrated as English justice in action. The executioner, a professional likely accustomed to such horrors, began his work. Wallace was hanged by the neck, but the rope was carefully positioned to strangle rather than break the neck, ensuring maximum suffering. The crowd watched as he writhed, his face darkening, his body convulsing in the agony of asphyxiation. But before death could claim him, the rope was cut and Wallace was left alive, gasping, his ordeal far from over. What followed was the most nightmarish part of the punishment. While Wallace still lived, the executioner cut open his abdomen with a sharp blade, pulling out his internal organs one by one. Contemporary accounts spoke of screams unlike any the witnesses had ever heard, raw, unearthly sounds that seemed to tear through the air itself. Each organ was displayed to the crowd before being cast into a waiting fire. The symbolism was pointed. In medieval thought, the bowels were seen as the seat of compassion and emotion. Burning them before his eyes was meant to strip Wallace of his humanity itself, reducing him to something less than human in the perception of the crowd. The stench of burning flesh mixed with the screams created a horror beyond imagination, a spectacle designed to sear itself into memory. Remarkably, Wallace endured. Accounts say his eyes remained open, his awareness unbroken even as his body was torn apart. Some chroniclers claimed he tried to speak, though his words are lost to history. The executioner's grim skill was not in killing swiftly, but in prolonging life just enough to maximize suffering. In this theater of cruelty, death itself became a mercy, withheld until the very end. At last, with the crowd clamoring, the executioner moved to finish the deed. Wallace's head was severed cleanly with a sharp axe, bringing a final release from agony. Yet even in death, humiliation continued. His severed head was raised high, blood still dripping, before being reserved for public display. The body was quartered, limbs hacked off and held aloft before the crowd like grotesque trophies. The remains were not discarded but used as tools of domination. Wallace's head was tarred to preserve it and mounted on London Bridge, where it stood for years as a chilling warning. His 4 quarters were sent to different cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, each a site chosen to remind the Scottish population of England's reach. This distribution of body parts was not mere brutality, but calculated political theatre, a message written in flesh. For Edward I, the aftermath seemed to justify the cruelty. The execution shattered many of Wallace's supporters. Resistance appeared to falter as men calculated that no cause was worth such horror. Many fled into exile, while others submitted to English rule, determined never to risk a similar fate. In the immediate sense, the execution worked. Wallace, the symbol of defiance, was transformed into a gruesome warning. Yet Edward had misjudged. The very savagery of Wallace's death did not erase his cause, it inflamed it. The spectacle, meant to destroy a legend, instead created one. Stories of Wallace's endurance spread, whispered in taverns and villages across Scotland. His refusal to cry out, his calm defiance, his suffering, all became the ingredients of martyrdom. Robert the Bruce, who would later rise to lead Scotland, was said to have been deeply moved by Wallace's fate, seeing in it the unmasking of English rule. Far from quelling resistance, the horror of 1305 became fuel for a renewed struggle. Wallace's death revealed to the Scots that capture meant not only defeat, but degradation beyond imagination. The lesson was clear. Better to die in battle than to submit to English chains. From that day onward, a culture of no quarter took root. To be captured was worse than death. Therefore, mercy was neither expected nor granted. Wallace's destruction had forged a harsher, more desperate resistance, one unwilling to compromise, one willing to fight to the end. The execution of William Wallace remains one of history's most notorious examples of state cruelty. Intended to erase both the man and his legacy, it instead immortalized him as a symbol of freedom. His body was scattered, but his story endured, reshaped, retold, and carried forward into legend. In trying to destroy him, Edward I had made Wallace eternal. The political consequences of Wallace's execution reached far beyond Scotland's borders. Other European kingdoms watched with a mix of interest and revulsion, seeing in it a chilling demonstration of English methods. Methods that, they realized, could just as easily be turned against them. The sheer cruelty of Wallace's death became woven into England's reputation, contributing to a sense of isolation that would later complicate its foreign policy. Edward I's message of strength had certainly been received, but alongside it came a message of ruthless brutality. The historical record of Wallace's execution is unusually extensive. Multiple contemporary sources provide a remarkably detailed picture of the events of that day. The Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, describes the execution in stark, almost clinical language, noting both the crowd's reactions and the duration of Wallace's torment. Though clearly biased toward the English perspective, these accounts are valuable windows into medieval attitudes toward justice and punishment. Scottish accounts, though fewer, tell a different story. The Chronicle of John of Fordun portrays Wallace as a martyr who faced death with unshakable courage, emphasizing his refusal to beg for mercy or abandon his cause. These narratives, though romanticized, capture the impact of Wallace's death on the Scottish imagination. They help turn a military defeat into a moral victory, transforming a rebel into a symbol of national dignity. Legal records from the trial and execution, preserved in the English National Archives, provide perhaps the most objective evidence. They reveal the meticulous planning behind both the proceedings and the punishment. Every step was documented, from the formal charges to the precise disposal of Wallace's body. These records suggest that the English authorities were fully aware they were creating a historical moment, one designed to be remembered. Eyewitness descriptions from both English and Scottish observers add further layers of detail. Some accounts dwell on the mob's bloodthirsty enthusiasm, while others highlight Wallace's stoic composure as he endured the ordeal. Taken together, these perspectives underscore the complexity of the event and the very different meanings it carried for opposing sides. The legacy of William Wallace's execution stretches far beyond the immediate politics of 1305. In the centuries that followed, his story became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, inspiring generations to resist foreign domination. The brutality that was meant to destroy him instead elevated him. In death, Wallace became a more powerful figure than he had ever been in life. His fate also influenced the gradual development of ideas about law and human rights. Later jurists and philosophers would cite Wallace's execution as an example of judicial cruelty that violated the basic dignity owed even to enemies of the state. From such reactions, the earliest concepts of humane treatment and the limits of state power began to emerge. Culturally, the impact was immense. Wallace's death inspired songs, poems, ballads, and, in later centuries, novels and films. Each retelling found new meaning in his sacrifice. The execution scene, in particular, became a lasting symbol of the eternal struggle between tyranny and freedom, oppression and justice. Psychologically, the effect on the Scottish people was profound. His death created a shared trauma, a wound that cut deep into the national psyche. Yet from that wound came unity. Wallace's execution gave Scotland a collective memory of suffering that military victories alone could never have achieved. His torment became a source of strength, proof that dignity could survive even in the face of the most dehumanizing cruelty. The method of execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was itself a political statement. Reserved for traitors, it was meant to enforce the sacred bond between king and subject. By applying it to Wallace, Edward I was asserting that all people of the British Isles were, in his view, his subjects, whether they acknowledged it or not. The public nature of the ritual was equally significant. Medieval justice was theatre. Punishment was performance, carefully staged to reinforce hierarchy and authority. Wallace's death was one of the most elaborate such performances of its age. It was not only the destruction of a body, but also the shaping of memory, a lesson taught through spectacle. The crowd, too, was part of this performance. They were not passive observers, but participants in a ritual of state power. Their jeers, their shouts, their very presence legitimized the act. The execution was designed to condition the audience as much as punish the victim. The painstaking documentation of the entire event indicates that the English crown knew it was shaping a narrative for history. From the route of the procession to the placement of body parts, every detail was intended to echo far into the future. Wallace's punishment was as much about storytelling as it was about justice. The international dimension should not be overlooked. Medieval Europe was a tightly connected world where news traveled fast and reputation mattered. Wallace's execution was witnessed by foreign dignitaries and reported widely. It helped cement England's image as a kingdom prepared to use extreme measures to maintain control. That reputation would shape diplomacy and perceptions of English rule for decades to come. Reflecting on Wallace's death forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior and power. The crowds who gathered to watch were not monsters, but ordinary men and women conditioned to accept and even enjoy the destruction of another human being. Their willingness to treat cruelty as entertainment demonstrates how easily brutality can be normalized when sanctioned by authority. Equally disturbing is how institutionalized the process had become. The executioner was a professional, skilled in the art of prolonging suffering. The officials who organized the event were bureaucrats carrying out routine procedures. The horrifying reality is that Wallace's ordeal was not extraordinary, but part of a system. The normalization of cruelty is often more terrifying than the cruelty itself, showing how fragile civilization truly is. The transformation of Wallace from rebel to martyr highlights the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward I intended the execution to prove the futility of resistance. Instead, it immortalized resistance. The sheer excess of the spectacle ensured its failure as a deterrent. The horror became something greater than itself, transcending the king's intentions to stand as a testament to sacrifice and principle. That enduring fascination reveals something about human nature. We need heroes who embody courage, even in the face of unbearable suffering. Wallace's story satisfies that need. It demonstrates that true victory is not always military, but moral, that dignity can survive even when everything else is stripped away. His spirit triumphed where his body could not. Ultimately, the execution of William Wallace is a story about the price of freedom and the cost of principle. In the modern world, where liberty often feels secure, it is easy to forget that such freedoms were won through immense suffering. Wallace's horrific death is a reminder that freedom has never been free, that it was purchased with lives, with blood, with unimaginable pain. His story continues to resonate because the struggle between oppression and liberty is never over. The methods of suppression may change, but the fundamental conflict endures. Wallace's execution reminds us that there are causes worth suffering for, values worth dying for, and choices every generation must make anew. The cobblestones of medieval London may be silent now, but they still seem to echo with the lesson of that day. That the human spirit, even when broken and destroyed, can inspire others to rise. The execution that was meant to obliterate William Wallace instead ensured that his name would never be forgotten.